Welcome to Canadian Innovators, the show that celebrates innovation, entrepreneurs, and the Canadian spirit. I'm Jocelyn, and every week we introduce a new entrepreneur, tell their stories, and unpack the challenges of keeping jobs in Canada, as well as discuss potential solutions for job growth and prosperity. Have you been to the pumps lately? We've almost become numb to the impacts of inflation. We see it in the grocery stores and in almost every item we buy. And why are we allowing this to happen? Canada is blessed that we have an abundance of natural resources and we have the most stringent environmental and safety regulations. Unfortunately, we have a federal government that is determined to destroy our resource sector, and in doing so will decimate the manufacturing sector by burdening them with unaffordable energy. Joining us to discuss this today is Bryan Gould, President and Chief Executive Officer of Aspenleaf Energy. Aspenleaf operates assets in Swan Hills, Leduc, and Twinnings regions of Alberta. Bryan was born and raised in Toronto. He attended the University of Toronto and graduated in 1982 with a Master's of Applied Science and Chemical Engineering degree. Upon graduation, he joined Shell Canada as a reservoir engineer and moved west to Calgary. He has experience in development of operations in conventional oil and gas assets, oil sands, and unconventional resource play. Bryan is an active advocate for the Canadian energy sector and is currently the chair of CAP, also known as the Canadian Association for Petroleum Producers Industry Reputation Priority Steering Group, and also the chair of the CAP's Conventional CEO Council. Welcome to the program, Bryan. That's quite a resume. So before we get started, I'm sure people want to know what the difference between unconventional and conventional assets. So if you could give us just a quick overview on that.
Love to, Jocelyn, and thanks for having me today. So conventional, unconventional nomenclature actually goes back historically. So unconventional plays are now conventional, frankly, and there's little differentiation. So the big difference was there are reservoirs, so subsurface formations that contain oil and gas that historically were not producible because the ability to flow oil or gas through that rock was too low. But with the advent of modern technology, horizontal drilling and fracking, those quote unquote unconventional reservoirs became achievable to exploit and to extract oil and gas. So although it's called conventional and unconventional, in a funny way, unconventional is now more conventional, and what used to be conventional is now unconventional. So long answer to your question, but it's all about the quality of the rock.
Okay, that's a good overview. So Bryan, could you give us a quick overview of Aspenleaf and energy and what you do? We've got some pictures, and if you could just walk us through what you folks do.
Sure. So we started Aspenleaf Energy about 8 years ago, Jocelyn. Three of my former colleagues from Shell and myself. We're a junior oil producer, privately held. Our prime financial backers are ARC Financial and Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, but we have a significant number of other investors. And we have invested in buying and developing oil assets in Alberta. So we have 3 fields that we currently operate. With production just over between 20 and 25,000 barrels a day production. And we're very proud of the company. We started it with a vision of governance, and I'm pleased to say that it's turned out as well as or better than we'd hoped.
That's a great story. Now, Bryan, a lot of entrepreneurs, when they first get started, have this time where they just don't know if they're going to make it. Did you ever have that moment where you were concerned about the business going forward, and how did you overcome it?
How much time do we have, Jocelyn? Because as you know, the oil business is one which is commodity based and highly cyclical, and it involves, frankly, investing massive amounts of capital with long-term payouts against the backdrop of these very volatile commodity prices. So we've had a number of cases not where we were really concerned about where we're going to live or die, but certainly where we were concerned about where we're going to be able to deliver a return for our investors.
Okay, well, I'm going to hold you there because we have to go to break. And when we get back, we're going to hear the rest of the story. You're watching Canadian Innovators. Don't go away. We're back. I'm talking with the president and CEO of Aspenleaf Energy, Bryan Gould. Before we went to the break, Bryan, you were telling us about a time where you were concerned about moving forward with the company. All entrepreneurs have that do or die moment. So we'll go back and pick up on that.
So I'll give you a couple of examples, Jocelyn. So we were on the verge of acquiring a company, our first major asset. We were all ready to go. And on New Year's Eve, I got a call from the bank saying that they were going to withdraw their support for the transaction, and we had to back away at the last minute. So that was one case. Of course, we've also suffered through price collapse, one when we didn't have enough export capacity and our price in Canadian dollars went down to almost zero. And then, of course, through the pandemic, we had negative pricing on some days. So a large number of times when we were worried about making a successful business.
So when we talk about export capacity, you mean we don't have the pipelines to get the oil through or the gas through to market? Is that correct?
That's correct. So there are times, Jocelyn, when we produce more than we can export. And at those times, prices in Canadian dollars collapse. And we all eat that as Canadians and Albertans.
So Bryan, Canadian companies, especially in the resource sector, have been leaders in innovation. Could you talk about some of your company's innovation initiatives?
Yeah, there's a couple of themes I'd love to highlight for you, Jocelyn. The first is the advances that we've made in drilling technology. So this is the ability to drill wells deep underground and direct them into oil and gas reservoirs. And what I can tell you, certainly at our time in Aspenleaf compared to when we started, we're now able to drill wells 3 times as long, 40% faster, and all that leads to efficient deployment of capital and the ability to extract more energy at lower cost, to the benefit of society. The other area that I'm particularly proud in is the innovation we've shown in relationships, particularly with First Nations. This is a big deal for us at Aspenleaf, and we're very proud of relationships that we've built. In one instance, we've helped a First Nation build their own entrepreneurial company to abandon and reclaim old wellbores. We're particularly proud of that. And in this case, we're giving them a hand up, not a handout. And we've helped them create this company and give them all of our business for the first year to get them launched. And just yesterday, I was up north. There's a First Nation that has unfortunately discovered grave sites associated with a residential school. And yesterday we established an endowment fund so that they can educate their children and future generations with regard to their culture and language. So we innovate not just in terms of business, but also in terms of relationships with community.
A remarkable story. Bryan, the war in the Ukraine has certainly got a lot of people to have a different view on the fossil fuel industry. There certainly seems to be a link between having a strong resource sector and protecting democracy. Do you see this link?
I see 2 links, Jocelyn. First off, in my view, economic strength is absolutely essential to defending democracy. And you can look back to the Cold War and the collapse of the Iron Curtain in the former Soviet Union for evidence of that. So without economic strength, I don't think we can defend democracy. And then beyond that, for me, affordable and secure energy is paramount for our societal needs and for our prosperity. So yes, we need economic strength, and that economic strength to a large degree comes through energy and modern materials.
So I know that a lot of activists have focused on the financial communities and getting them to divest in fossil fuel and our resource sector. Do you see that? And do you see the war in Ukraine as maybe changing their opinions?
I'm hopeful that it changes, but to be candid, I don't think it's changing fast enough. And I look at at the public markets and valuations, and anyone running an oil company today is highly incented to not invest, but just to basically harvest what they've got and return capital to investors. So I think we are still suffering through what I would call a bit of a mythical narrative about off fossil fuel, and we're suffering the consequences of that through massive underinvestment, which I don't think is being healed as fast as it needs to be.
Yeah, and absolutely, it impacts not only the consumers, everyday Canadians, but also the manufacturers, because if we don't have affordable energy, we aren't able to operate our businesses optimally. So we're going to go to break, and we'll be right back. You're watching Canadian Innovators. Welcome back. I'm Jocelyn Bamford. My guest today is Bryan Gould, President and Chief Executive Officer of Aspenleaf Energy. Before we went to the break, we were talking about how the shift in many citizens of the world's view on the fossil fuel industry, and how has inflation fueled a more realistic view amongst ordinary Canadians?
Well, so obviously people are feeling pain at the pump, Jocelyn. I should point out for your listeners that there are a lot of steps between us producing crude oil and natural gas and what they experience at the pump, because that crude oil, for example, has to go through refineries and marketing. So there's lots of steps to contribute to their cost at the pump, including a very significant amount of taxes. So some of this is driven by the world price of crude oil, and some of it is driven by other factors. Unfortunately, in my view, the world price is what it is, largely because of chronic underinvestment in the fossil fuel industries, partly driven by what I would consider a mythical view about sort of a fun, fast, and easy transition to other forms of energy. And I'm not anti other forms of energy. In fact, I'm pro all energy, but I think we need to be realistic about pragmatic costs and timeframes to transition our systems.
So, Bryan, a lot of large companies are now on the ESG bandwagon, and it seems like this is the flavor of the month for many large companies, not really understanding the impact on Canadian citizens, jobs, our economy, and the manufacturing sector. So how did they get so many companies to sign on with net zero and the UN Agenda 2030? And how's that going to affect affordability and jobs here in Canada?
So I'm going to answer a slightly different question, Jocelyn. So for me, there's good parts of ESG, but those good parts have existed for time immemorial. So good governance of a company has existed for time immemorial. Managing and maintaining relationships with key stakeholders and employees has always been a part of running a successful business, as has being protective and sensitive to environmental impacts. So in my mind, there's really nothing new about that. What is new is the way I think corporate governance is being overridden by outsiders with no accountability towards the investment community. Now, why people are signing on in the fashion they are, I can't speak for others, but I would conjecture that CEOs are actually very fearful now. We now live in a society, cancel culture, et cetera, where the herd is moving in a direction and CEOs are afraid to speak their mind and say what they really think for fear of being attacked by outsiders who don't invest in their companies and have no stake and no interest. So to me, it's a sad commentary on, frankly, an erosion of freedom of expression and freedom of speech.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing it. And it used to be that CEOs would be focusing on their customers, their shareholders, and their employees. And now it seems like they focus on the mainstream media, politicians, and activists. And that's really not going to get us to where we need to be. Bryan, I'm hearing from almost every manufacturer and business that are struggling with affordable energy. And how do you think the current federal government's position on the oil and gas industry is impacting affordable energy?
So I start, Jocelyn, with a negative narrative. So the whole off fossil fuel, we don't need this stuff, it's nasty, it's dirty, and the faster we can get rid of it, the better. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, what I would call this mythical thinking of, a transition is fun, fast, and easy. And transition will take a long time. It will be costly. It will be difficult. And in fact, the technologies that we require for that transition to a large degree don't exist, let alone supply chains, access to materials, geopolitical concerns. So this is a big, complex issue, which will not be transitioning nearly as fast as people talk. And we will need fossil fuels for a very long period of time to come and require investment to maintain that supply.
So in the 30 seconds we have left, what do you think the impact of all of this is going to be on Canadian jobs?
I think it has a negative impact on Canadian jobs. As you pointed out, high energy prices spin through the economy. It's going to lead to high food prices, loss of manufacturing jobs, and a monumental lost opportunity for us to export our products that are much needed by our allies, particularly in Western Europe.
Yeah, we're seeing that 100%. So we're going to go to break. And when we come back, we're going to chat more with Bryan Gould from Aspenleaf Energy. Don't go away. Welcome back. Before we went to break, we were talking about federal government's policies on affordable energy and its impact on Canadian competitiveness. Bryan, what do you see from your view as the biggest hindrance to getting the economy in Canada moving again?
So for me, Jocelyn, it feels like we have lost our drive to compete, and we're more focused on how we distribute the economic pie than growing the economic pie. I think even former Finance Minister Morneau's comments were pretty enlightening the other day. So in my view, we need to focus on being more competitive, on not vilifying industry and entrepreneurs, but in celebrating them and what they do for our society, and celebrating the creation of prosperity and wealth, not vilifying it. So somehow we've got to where being in business and creating profit and wealth is a bad thing. And in my mind, prosperity is a good thing, and prosperity leads to being able to pay for all the social programs that we want, and it enables us to be more protective of the environment. It enables us to protect our democracy. So it all starts with prosperity for me.
I couldn't agree more. Bryan, this is the part of the show that every week I ask my guests, if you were a politician, what were the 3 things you would do to grow jobs and the economy? So Bryan, you're on the hot seat. What would you do?
So clearly I'm not qualified to be a politician. The first thing I would do is I would change the narrative from business is bad to business is good. I would be much more supportive of trying to attract capital to the country, which creates jobs, good jobs, employment, and wealth and prosperity. So I would do everything I could to attract investment, not defer investment. I would focus on building key infrastructures so that we can get our products to global markets. And I would definitely fight what I think is an overgrown bureaucracy within government, and that extends pretty widespread through many jurisdictions. Based on my industry experience, I think there's a golden opportunity to get much more value and service delivery for the money that we spend. And this does not mean a war on frontline workers. I think we could have actually more frontline workers if we were able to skinny down the bureaucratic back room and free up people to deliver the services that they're there to deliver.
I'm supporting you there, Bryan, for Prime Minister. Bryan, I'm going to talk about a phenomenon that I've seen. I've heard many oil and gas executives speaking of late, and it seems that a lot of the executives in the resource sector seem to get along with a woke culture. And as Winston Churchill famously said, an appeaser is one who feeds a crocodile, hoping that it will eat him last. So why, in your opinion, have the executives and the groups supporting the resource industry become appeasers?
I think, Jocelyn, it comes back to this war on free speech, and anyone who veers from the pack and this common narrative, and narrative has become a substitute for facts and good decision making, in my view. You're fearful of being attacked by the pack, right? And so I talk to many CEOs who, behind the scenes, their language and their view is very different than what they think they're forced to say publicly. And I think it's just a very sad commentary on the state of our democracy.
So we got about 30 seconds left. If you could just give us your prediction for the resource sector in the next 2 years.
I would say for the next year, I think you're going to see a continuation of what we are seeing, which is returning capital to investors because there is no incentive to grow production. You're not rewarded for market valuation. And unfortunately, I think that's going to mean continuing elevated energy prices for a time. But I am optimistic that eventually common sense will prevail. And I think you'll start to see some growth in the sector, maybe a year and a half, 2 years out. But it's going to take some time.
Well, thank you, Bryan. Fascinating conversation. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's all the time we have today. Thanks to my guest, Bryan Gould, CEO of Aspenleaf Energy. We could get our clean liquefied natural gas to China and India and help them come off coal. We could have a cleaner planet and prosperity here in Canada. Imagine how affordable energy would assist Canadians in their home and work life. We could achieve all this if we had federal politicians with the will to do this. I'm Jocelyn Bamford. Thanks for watching Canadian Innovators, and we'll see you next time.